Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today. My name's Amy Wayne, and I'm the Food Safety Content Manager at Provision Analytics. I'm joined today by the head of our Strategic Advisory Group, Dr. Jennifer McEntire, and today we plan to discuss not just the current state of FSMA 204, but what businesses should expect moving forward. As the 2026 compliance date approaches, it's important to think not only about minimizing effort, but maximizing the value that can be taken from the traceability requirements and the associated changes in the industry's landscape and infrastructure. To that end, who better to have with me for this discussion than Dr. McEntire? She's had an outstanding career in the industry, including notable positions with the International Fresh Produce Association, and she also received the 2020 NSF International Food Safety Leadership Award. These days, she heads up her own consultancy, Food Safety Strategy, and additionally offers insight and guidance to our teams here at Provision. Dr. McEntire, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. So it's been over 13 years since FSMA was signed in January of 2011. Since then, what advances do you think we've seen across the food landscape that have influenced the way companies approach the requirements?
Yeah, FSMA was monumental. It's recognized as being the largest change to our food safety system that had occurred for many decades. And it's really interesting to see the various rules as they've come out, how they've been implemented and interpreted. And then ultimately, we have to ask what's mattered? What change has it made? And I think one of the biggest things that I've seen resulting from FSMA is the transition from a voluntary HACCP program to a not voluntary at all regulation, a requirement to do preventive controls and really structuring what was a HACCP plan, but being more inclusive of the different types of hazards and the ways that they can be managed beyond those historical critical control points. Another big thing that FSMA did was move regulation onto the farm. And for produce, and for me having spent about 7 years with the produce industry representing that group, I know that there have been so many recalls, so many outbreaks, and so bringing some food safety focus onto the farm has been very challenging. Growers for a long time had used good agricultural practices, but having a regulation and having regulators come onto your farm that's a different thing. That's a different element. But to my question about how has it mattered? Where do we see public health having benefited from all of these regulations? Regulations, like I said, for farms, for processors, for importers. Now, traceability regulations that are coming down the pike. Has it made a difference? And it's really hard to tell, which can be kind of discouraging as a food safety professional to not have that, and as a scientist, to not have that measurement, to not have that number and say, we've been able to decrease rates of foodborne illness by XYZ%. But do I think that it's mattered? Do I think that it's made a difference? Intuitively, yes, I do.
How do you feel about the consumer's perspective of food safety regulation and the visibility they now have into what's required of those providing the food that they eat?
It would probably surprise consumers if they knew how little regulation existed before the FSMA rules. So I think the rules that we have in place today, while we can debate the levels of enforcement, the levels of compliance, the levels of implementation, and their impact, I think that consumers expect that there is some sort of oversight for the food that we eat. We all eat several times a day. And you kind of, as a consumer, want to think that someone is managing this, that the food is being produced in a safe way. In the United States, typically we take it for granted that food is going to be safe. That's not the case everywhere in the world. But in the US, it is our expectation that food is safe. And so when consumers see these disruptions, these failures of our food safety system, I think it continues to call into question if the level of oversight and if the regulations are enough.
For most, FSMA 204 enforcement is almost seen as the end of FSMA. That is, once they've satisfied the requirements of 204, they can just move on. Once January of 2026 is here and compliance is expected, what comes next?
Food safety never ends. And so even though, yes, the traceability rule is, in my opinion, probably the biggest of the FSMA-related rules that's come out, and it has taken quite some time to get there, I don't think that this is a finish line, because I don't think there is a finish line. We'll always be facing new challenges. We'll always see unexpected things that occur, and we'll always need to respond. And the regulations always lag behind. I've been talking about traceability since 2008. Some of my colleagues have been talking about it before then. So it's not like you need to wait for a regulation to take action, to take appropriate action.
Compliance with the rule is set for January of 2026, but the FDA has signaled that enforcement may not begin until 2027. What kind of implications does this have for the industry?
I fear that some people have interpreted FDA's educate before and while we regulate, not come out with the big stick in January of 2026 as meaning that they can delay, that they can hold off, that really they can ignore that 2026 deadline, they can wait until 2027, or they can just roll the dice and wait for FDA to show up whenever they show up. And I don't think that that's wise for several reasons. First of all, because compliance is required in January of 2026. And if a company finds themselves in a recall or even worse, an outbreak situation, the expectation, not just the expectation, the requirement will be that they do have those traceability records that are specified within the rule. So you don't get a pass. Who knows if they're going to be implicated in an outbreak? Nobody knows. Everyone thinks it's not going to be them until it is. So I think it's imprudent to wait until 2027. That said, there are some barriers to implementation. This is a journey. I am certain that come January of 2026, it's not going to be like when we hit that date that a switch is flipped and suddenly everyone is in perfect compliance. So I think it's appropriate that FDA not be too hard on the industry and not be progressive, proactive with them in trying to enforce this rule. So I appreciate FDA's, I don't want to say leniency, but I appreciate FDA's recognition that people do need some time. But boy, if you're going to be one to take more time, you better make sure that you have your food safety preventive systems well in check.
Do you see future addenda to FSMA down the road, or even perhaps an entirely new package of legislation?
I think it's highly unlikely. However, I will say that usually when I say that, I'm wrong. When FSMA was passed, it was a big surprise. There had been talk about food safety legislation. It had been introduced for years before FSMA, and there was no reason to think that FSMA, as we know it today, that it would pass. And yet it did, and it changed everything. So what is the likelihood that moving forward that we'll have some new legislation? I think the likelihood that it'll be as monumental as FSMA is pretty low. But you never know what Congress is going to do, that's for sure. And we also don't know if there will be some outbreaks or other food safety related incidents that get the public activated, that create questions around how could this happen? Why isn't there more regulation? Why isn't there more oversight? And when congressional representatives hear these calls from their constituents, it may prompt action. So I don't see anything imminent. There has been legislation introduced for many years calling for a single food safety agency. Again, I have no reason to think it's going to pass this time. But yeah, usually when I say that, something unexpected happens.
We're seeing retailers like Kroger and now most recently Walmart universally apply the rules requirements on all food suppliers, irrespective of their commodities. Do you think the food traceability list will become a thing of the past in favor of just universal enforcement?
Eventually, yes. In the short term, no. And it's because people just need to start somewhere. And my recommendation is always start with where you think your greatest risk lies. And this was the approach that Congress directed FDA to take. Create a list of foods and require additional records for those foods. The problem with that approach, though, is, as we've seen, things change. And we do have outbreaks in vehicles that some people feel really caught off guard. And so I don't think that we should rely only on the past as we think about our traceability systems and which foods require enhanced traceability. That seems very short-sighted to me. So I understand from a public health standpoint why it would be ideal to have traceability for all foods. Also from just a practical standpoint, if you're a buyer, if you have distribution centers, you have warehouses, I cannot imagine the work it would take to have two different systems. A system for foods that are on the food traceability list and a different system, different processes, different handling procedures for foods that are not on the food traceability list. That just seems unmanageable and impractical. So from a retailer's perspective, I can understand why they just want harmony. They just want one system. I don't think that it's reasonable to ask the entirety of the food industry, including a lot of manufacturers, a lot of producers whose foods are not on the list, who this was not really on their radar, to meet these mandates even before the FDA deadlines.
As other nations advance their own food safety and sustainability regulations, there's some growing strain on international food trade. Do you see any possibility of further harmonization in international standards similar to GFSI?
Trade is tough. We do have a global food supply chain. This is undeniable. But there isn't today really parity in regulations. There are countries that don't even have stable governments. They're still producing food, exporting food. And so how we get there is definitely going to be a challenge. I think GFSI aimed to address this on the private side. So this was company driven. I'm a buyer. If you want to sell to me, here's what you need to do. And I don't care where in the world you are. And I think that can be effective. It's the power of the purse, they call it. From a regulatory standpoint, there is a mechanism that aims at harmonization, Codex Alimentarius, which does have representation from almost every country in the world. Breaks into different groups, committees, work groups, addressing different topics, different challenges. And it's a pretty reasonable structure, but it works at a really slow pace. And it often works at the lowest common denominator. And so I don't think that we're going to work through the Codex mechanism to achieve this sort of global harmonization, because we do see countries who are accelerating in one area or not in another area. And so it makes things difficult as a food producer, especially if you're in the global trade, importing or exporting, to try to keep up with the patchwork of regulations when we look from country to country, and also to just keep up with what's really important for food safety. And this is where sometimes I think there's maybe a little disconnect between the science, the fundamentals of food safety, and what those regulatory requirements are and what the buyer requirements are.
In our industry, smart food safety is a huge focus. Do you see any possibility of future regulations moving towards specific tech solutions, such as mandating specific technology be used to unify data across markets?
From a regulatory standpoint, I do not see that the regulators would move towards specifying or prescribing a specific solution. This is something that they usually shy away from for many reasons, and I totally get it. But when they don't, especially when we're talking about standards, it leaves flexibility. The flexibility is the good word, but we can also call that uncertainty, vagueness, lack of harmonization. And so it becomes a double-edged sword. If FDA were to write prescriptive standards specifying a technology, I think there would be quite an uproar. So it becomes left to the private side, to the industry, to align on how are we going to best tackle this. And I'm a big fan of interoperability. The example that I often use, and there are several others, is like the phone. I have an iPhone, it's on Verizon. I can call somebody who's on a landline or on a voice over IP, and they can be on have a different service provider, and we can pay different prices. I can pay for the enhanced package. You could have the really cheapo phone. We can still call each other because there are standards in place. And I think that that's the important thing, that we are all working within standards so that data can be shared. It facilitates data sharing.
Do you see a future where data is more readily shared between companies or across the industry for the good of public health?
I have been in conversations about data sharing for many, many years. Years ago, when we didn't have digital data, when we didn't have the electronic systems in place, it was more difficult to share data, to analyze your data, to compare data sets. But today, we really don't have that excuse. And with the systems that are available to the community, to the food community today, it does beg the question, why aren't you sharing your data? And I think that we will reach a tipping point. We're not there yet, I don't think. Some point, there's going to be sharing of data for the good of the community and for meta-analysis, to look at trends, not just, I don't care just about my data. I want to understand other people's data. I want to be able to look bigger picture. I think at some point we will get there. And then those who aren't sharing data may be viewed with some skepticism. Like, what do you have to hide? Again, I don't think we're quite there yet. And there are some legitimate reasons why people don't share data. Some could be the quality of the data itself, that people may know that they've got a lot of stuff, but is it understandable? Is it digestible? Has it been collected and structured in a systematic way where you can make sense of the data? So that's one issue. The other is trust. That's what it boils down to. Do I trust that if I share data, this information is not going to be used against me, that it is going to be used for the greater good? I'll call out the Green Link initiative that Western Growers has initiated as a data sharing system. It's limited in scope. It's limited in players, but pretty good representation within the industry. And it's looking at a bigger scale, trying to find these trends, trying to really learn from the data. Today, I see a lot of tests that are done, a lot of data that are collected, pass, fail. Did we do this? Yes, no. And it's to make a decision in the moment. If we can look at data trends, we can look at data beyond our data and start to make decisions on what we're going to do tomorrow or the next day, where things are trending. I think we can do a much better job and much more efficient job in food safety.
FSMA 204 is very specific on identifying the products that are most likely to see an outbreak, but it doesn't speak to the root cause behind those problems. Do you see a way for contextual data to play a role in traceability that can better enable the industry to move toward proactive or even predictive controls rather than being reactionary?
People look at traceability, at FSMA 204, the food traceability rule, as being reactive. And yes, it's triggered when there is an outbreak or there is a recall after the fact, and that's unfortunate. But I think the beauty of the ability to trace back, maybe not so much for the recall side, but for the trace back part, when there's an outbreak and we start with, we don't even know if it's food. Then from EPI, we can kind of hone in on some suspect foods. And then from trace back, we can try to identify a common source, whether that's a common manufacturer, a common farm, and what else was in common, the day of production, the line that something was run on. So we can try to focus in. Traceability gives us that laser focus into a point in time. That provides an incredible opportunity to understand what was happening at that point in time. Why did this contamination occur in the first place? And traceability today, you often can't get back. You can't even get back to what is a common producer, let alone a common point in time when a contamination event might have occurred. So if we trust that these traceability records will give us that accuracy, that specificity, I think it opens up a whole fantastic possibility to really figure out what happened. And if you can figure out what happened and do a root cause analysis, you should be able to put mechanisms in place to prevent that from happening again. And when it is something, a big event, a catastrophic event like an outbreak, it's generally FDA, the states, the company itself who are collaborating, ideally, collaborating and doing this root cause analysis. And then that information should become publicly available so that others can look and say, do I have some of these same other things going on that Maybe they haven't resulted in an outbreak yet, or at least not one that I'm aware of, but could. They have the potential. And I think that using data holistically to do that thorough root cause analysis, to look at your preventive systems and see what's effective, what's maybe not so effective, what else do I need, that is where we start to have a power to protect public health.
Technology is obviously an undeniable factor when we consider risk and compliance in today's landscape. What influence do you see new and emerging technologies having on the global food supply?
I'm a science geek, and so I'm super excited about some of the things that I'm seeing, and that I'm seeing them enter the realm of reality. Things that used to be just possibilities, wild ideas, wouldn't it be great, are becoming a little more practical and a little more feasible. And just in our daily lives, if you consider the way that technology influences what we do every day, we have to replicate that within the food system. We can't have a food system that is using old technology that's so archaic, that's so behind, that new talent is turned off to working for food companies. I want the food industry to be cool. And a lot of the technological innovations, the digitization, the things that I don't even fully understand, they're just kind of cool. And when we think beyond the coolness factor, and we think about how can it help food be safer? How can it help food safety professionals get their job done more effectively? How can it save time? I just see so much time being wasted. And it becomes very disheartening to see people who have the ability to think, but they're just so bogged down by paperwork. And so if we can transition to having some of these things automated, having some of these systems automated, having people, enabling people to make good decisions based on the data rather than doing some mundane and routine work, I think that's where we must go as an industry. And now the technology capabilities, the variety of things that can be done, it's there. It lies before us.
Are there any specific examples you could share of novel or interesting new tech that the food safety community should keep an eye on in the coming years?
Novel or new tech that the food industry can keep an eye on in the coming years? I could go in so many different directions with this. I like sensors. I like the idea that you have a sensor that can collect data automatically, often continuously. So you don't have to have a person pulling samples, like checking the chlorine concentration of their wash water, checking temperatures, that you have sensors that can do this. And then that those data can integrate into a bigger system. And then we can start looking at correlations of data, looking at how various factors come together. So we're not looking at systems in isolation. We're really looking at it as a big system. See what's happening to our food. We can look at some quality data and start making correlations. How can we optimize our supply chains? How can we make sure that we're delivering fresher, more palatable products to consumers, which then has a food waste impact? And so I'm looking at the possibilities at a big picture. How can we use some of these individual technologies in concert to make the system just operate so much more efficiently?
Provision's been fortunate enough to have you as a strategic advisor to give us some key insights into areas like market sentiment and areas of greatest interest. Is there any advice you'd offer to food companies, whether they be growers, packers, or processors in the produce or even food manufacturing and distributing areas, when it comes to approaching the issue of technology and choosing the right tools to use?
One of the things that I often advise my clients that are food producers, or even when I was with the associations and we had members that were in the food industry, is to start with clarity around what is the problem you're trying to solve. Because there are many cool things out there. There are many shiny objects, and they can be very, very distracting. So to really evaluate your own system and your own needs first, and come up with your must-haves and your nice-to-haves, and the things that you already have that you just don't need to replicate, or if there are inefficiencies that maybe you have, but it's not ideal, you want to do better, be really, really clear about that. And then look for technologies that can do those things for you. And if they can do more, fantastic. But make sure that they are doing the job that you need to get done. I think many of us have many vendors who send lots and lots of emails and promotional materials, pitching their wares. And maybe once in a while, something comes across my desk, an application that I had not thought of before. And so those are worthy of consideration. But I do warn people to be wary of snake oil salesmen. Unfortunately, there are some. And so to vet, as they're evaluating a company that's going to be providing some technology solution, to vet them, to ask their friends. The food industry is pretty small and very well networked. And good reputations spread, bad reputations also spread. And so to ask around what the experiences are and to ask the vendors who's working with you. Can you connect us with any of your current clients? I want to understand how the system's working for them. When I was at United Fresh Produce Association, we put together a list of questions to ask your vendors. And I think that, again, that clarity around what do you need? What is your problem? That's got to be the starting point. That's the prerequisite. One of the reasons, maybe the reason, that I accepted the invitation to be on the Strategic Advisory Board for Provision was because I'd seen a demo of the system and I thought that the system was good. There are many systems out there. There's competition in the marketplace, and I think it's healthy to keep everybody on their toes. But one of the things that I really liked about Provision was the customer service, for lack of a better term. The ability to really work with companies, that it wasn't just a straight out of the box, here's what you've got and you cannot modify it, take it or leave it, figure it out on your own kind of technology. And I've seen some that are really very powerful when the salespeople are giving the demos, but I think about how would I ever be able to figure this out? It's kind of overwhelming. And that's one of the things that I really liked about Provision was the onboarding process. These were some of the questions that I asked on behalf of a client that was looking at a variety of solutions. How would they start? And the team that Provision has and the approach, just to me, it's like a philosophical kind of cultural approach to working with clients was very attractive to me. And to me, that's a differentiator, and it's a differentiator that matters.
Besides the issue of satisfying regulatory requirements or maintaining compliance, what are the most relevant benefits that you see to food companies that are adopting technology?
When it comes to using software for traceability or for any sort of regulation, the regulation is supposed to be the minimum requirement. The regulation is supposed to be the floor, not the ceiling. And so using technology just to satisfy any kind of regulatory requirement seems short-sighted, and also rarely do I see that have a return on investment. So you really need to think bigger. If you're going to make an investment into a technology solution, think about how it can help your business. And for traceability, there are many examples, many applications. They're situation specific, depending on where you are in the supply chain, depending on the systems you have today, kind of what that delta looks like. But most of the benefits of traceability are outside of food safety because, fortunately, those outbreaks, those recalls are relatively rare events. We also have to consider consumer confidence. And when we have big outbreaks, when we have lengthy recalls, big recalls, this erodes consumer confidence. I represented the produce industry in 2018 when there were the romaine outbreaks, and they went on. They never were traced back to a single producer, a single brand that could issue a recall. And so we saw the government come out with a don't eat romaine. Well, what does that do to people? How does that impact people's perception of the industry if we can't trace things back? And so I think that having that consumer confidence, it's difficult to measure, especially as an individual firm. But I do think that this is something that should also be considered when we're looking at the benefits of traceability.
So obviously there's no way to predict with 100% certainty what'll happen next with food safety. But if you could design a future for the industry, what is it you'd like to see happen in an ideal situation?
In my dream utopian future of food safety, we wouldn't have foodborne illness. It just wouldn't exist. We would have great controls. This is not realistic. It's never going to happen. But then I think we can kind of back up and say, well, what are the steps that one would need to take to try to get there? From the regulatory side, would it be useful to have a single food safety agency? I'm not convinced that that's the solution. I think that there's more value in really evaluating what the industry can already do. Some of it is the basics that does not need technology, just needs some common sense, and well-trained people. And I do give a lot of thought to the future workforce, who's going to be coming into the industry, how have they grown up as digital natives? So I have a daughter who just started college, and I've had interns that are in college, and I realize how very old I am, and just the things that are natural for them and the things that they expect. It's not necessarily where the industry is at today. So I think taking advantage of their youth and enthusiasm and some of the technologies that they bring to the table while arming them with the fundamentals, the basics of hazards versus risks, the basics of some elements of engineering. I have to say a little bit. It's not all the fun stuff, but if you know the basics and you can employ technologies in a useful way, I think that today we're not taking advantage of the mounds, the reams of data that we have. And I think that we can find nuggets there that we can improve our system. So again, some of them are obvious today that we can look and say that was just mostly a failure of people and people's lack of willingness to take action. But if we can make people's jobs maybe a little bit more exciting, let technology do the boring work. Let people do the analysis. Let people do the critical thinking based on the data that are being collected. That's where I think we can have a food safety system in the future that is well running, that produces food for our population, which is growing. Our population is changing. More people who are vulnerable to some of these foodborne illnesses. I think that we can ideally keep pace and really get ahead of this. At a minimum, keep pace. Really want to get ahead of this and do better in the future than we're doing today.
Dr. McEntire, it was great to have the chance to talk to you. Thanks so much again for taking the time. To everyone else out there, if you have any questions about Provision, our platform, and what we can offer your program, visit our website at www.provision.io and see what our programs have to offer.